Hi, I'm Margherita Capacci and I'm working with Stephanie and Janet as their editorial intern. So, this summer collection has my 4 top picks from last year, which helped me to understand better some of the cases going on this year. This is the 4th and last episode of this summer collection. So, to me, this is a general reminder that, especially when there's a wide scale mobilization in international justice around the case, like the one in Ukraine, and there is a felt need to seek justice quickly, it is important to still have someone who monitors trials independently and keep us updated. I hope you'll enjoy it.
The courts knew we were watching, and different audiences, including affected communities, knew that our reports were neutral. They weren't filtered through the outreach arm or branch of the court. And sometimes as monitors, we raise some uncomfortable and unwelcome topics.
Justice plays an important role.
I consider this tribunal a false tribunal and indictments false indictments.
Such abhorrent crimes must not go unpunished.
Proceedings will be long and complex.
All rise. Hi, welcome to Asymmetrical Haircuts. I'm Stephanie van den Berg, and as always, I have Janet Anderson with me too. Hi, Janet.
Hi. Well, today we're going to look at something that's kind of interesting, but maybe a bit sad, maybe a bit intriguing for true international justice nerds. Open Society Foundations, their Justice Initiative, has stopped its long-running monitoring of a variety of trials.
This is really going to make my job as a journalist covering international justice quite hard because, when you're following all these different types of trials and there's a lot going on at the same time, I just don't have the time or the means to go to all of them daily. So I use the Open Society Foundation Monitoring Initiative very extensively, and I'm really, really upset that it's going to end, actually.
Well, I think we should mention the precise title. It's ijmonitor.org, and they're still keeping up all of their reports. What it did was make us think about what the use is of monitoring trials. I mean, who impact it's really for, who's doing the monitoring, because there are many organizations doing this, not only Open Society, and really what kind of uses people can put it to. So we thought that would be a good opportunity to talk to Taegin Reisman. Taegin, hi, you're now the content officer with OSJI.
Hi, good afternoon. Happy Friday. Thank you for having me.
And you were also the manager of the International Justice Monitor previously. So thank you very much for coming on to chat to us about it.
We also have Jennifer Easterday. She's the executive director now of Just Peace Labs. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, how are you?
And she was there and started monitoring with the trial of Liberian leader Charles Taylor, which was for the Special Court for Sierra Leone, but happening in The Hague, that I also managed to catch some of the beginning of. But let's start with Taegin. Why is Justice Monitor stopping? It started in 2007. Why now end it?
Well, there's really 2 parts to that answer. The first is that even though Open Society Justice Initiative sits within a very large, well-funded foundation, we still have to justify our budget. We operate somewhat as a NGO, and that budget is finite, of course. And with new emerging situations and conflicts in the world, we, made the decision that it was time to wind down the monitoring work. We were committed to seeing through a couple trials that were ongoing, such as the judgment in the Angwin case and through the appeals in the Nadeganda case. And part of the legacy of that work and that exit was also the development of the trial monitoring guide. And the second reason was that we saw an encouraging trend in the field in that there were other NGOs and civil society organizations picking up more trial monitoring work of these grave crimes trials. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that at the ICC level, but certainly in different contexts in Europe, in universal jurisdiction cases, Civis Maxima has been doing some great work, and the Syria Justice and Accountability Center has also been covering the Reisman trial in Germany, which is the first grave crimes trials for anything that has happened in Syria. We felt it was a good time to start winding down our own work and let others take the mantle.
What will you miss most about this trial monitoring, Taegin?
So first is, I think, we built a great team of journalists and lawyers, academics who had monitored trials over, more than a decade. And so I think working with such smart and dedicated, hardworking people that, when you're covering these trials over years and you're having contact with these individuals on a daily basis, they really become part of your life. So I think for me personally, that interaction that I got from the team will definitely, I'll miss that a lot. The other part, I think, that I think was unique about the work, especially in the context of some of the work that we do in the Justice Initiative and other NGOs, a lot of our work is long-term advocacy-oriented projects or litigation that often take several months or years to see any results from or for the public to be informed about. Whereas this project, we were putting out new information that didn't exist otherwise into the world every day that had a real impact on, that reached affected communities, that reached journalists that could then, communicate that back out. And so it was great to, kind of leave every day knowing that we put something new out into the world that had some meaning. It was kind of nice to have that feeling of accomplishment on a regular basis.
Let me bring you in here, Jennifer, because you were involved right at the start. As we mentioned, it was the trial of Charles Taylor at the Special Court of Sierra Leone, but happening in The Hague and even happening at the premises of the ICC, how to confuse people. And I look back to see how this was described at the time, and it was described as kind of independent outreach for West African audiences. So you're really saying, okay, courts might do their own kind of outreach, but we need to talk to audiences directly. Is that what it was about?
Well, a little bit, yeah. So the Special Court for Sierra Leone monitoring program, which was run then by the UC Berkeley War Crimes Study Center, was really envisioned as this opportunity to monitor the trial in situ. So our original monitors were in Sierra Leone, they were in Freetown, monitoring the court from the beginning. And yes, the idea was to help bridge the distance between the hybridity of the Sierra Leone trial, to help bring some independent, neutral reports about the court, and have a presence there in Freetown, because a lot of the international groups were not able to maintain a steady presence in Freetown. And then when the trial of Charles Taylor moved to The Hague, it was seen as important to be able to follow that trial along, to then bridge back to those groups in Freetown who were no longer able to monitor the trial that was happening in The Hague, and that was happening so far away from a court that was meant to be located close to the affected population.
Yeah, it really cuts to the heart, doesn't it, of some of the issues that we cover regularly on international justice, that it feels so far away from people. So monitoring's this way of bridging?
I think in some ways, monitoring can be a way of bridging. I think monitoring can also be a way, this is always my shtick. If you've heard me talk about trial monitoring before, it really depends on the audience and the intended objective of the monitoring project. But monitoring can serve to monitor the institution. We did a little bit of that with the Special Court for Sierra Leone because it was a relatively new model. We also did more institutional level monitoring there, looking at the efficiency of trials, whether fair trial rights were being respected. Then at the ICC level, you have you have different groups doing some of that monitoring. You have the International Bar Association, who did really the fair trial rights oriented monitoring. You have a whole advocacy institution or field now, it seems, that follows the court, the ICC court itself. So it's not always a bridging exercise. Sometimes it serves different purposes. David Cohen at the War Crimes Study Center, he was a historian, I believe, by training. And so there was also this interest in recording the trials for posterity, just to keep a record so that we can understand how these trials and how these institutions operated.
I wanted to say that one of the things that struck me is that I'm always very into whatever precedent the former Yugoslav tribunal said, but they had set up a whole special kind of news agency called Sense, which would basically monitor the trials and have TV programs and documentaries about how these trials unfolded to be sent back to the local population because of how these trials were removed. And that was always an important function, and at the ICC they're trying to do that a bit themselves, but there's really not that kind of independent organization doing that. And I think that's a real problem with the ICC, is that it's hard to bring these trials to local people, and in a way trial monitoring provides a bit of that with some of the work that you did. What sticks in your mind really as a piece of writing or impact that you had in that period, Jennifer?
It's really hard to pick one. I think it's really, you mentioned it at the beginning of this question. For me, I'll focus on the impact rather than one specific piece of writing, but I think the largest impact that we had both at the War Crime Studies Center monitoring the Charles Taylor trial and the ICC monitoring work was the courts knew we were watching, and different audiences, including affected communities, knew that our reports were neutral. They weren't filtered through the outreach arm or branch of the court. And sometimes as monitors, we raised some uncomfortable and unwelcome topics. We were equally critical of the prosecution strategies and different judgments that the judges in the courts would come down with, as much as we would question some of the movements and some of the issues of witness protection or the registry. So we really were watching and reporting on all the different branches and all the different arms involved in these trials, and frankly got some pushback along the way. But to me, that means that they knew we were watching, they knew it was neutral, and people could then trust more the output of what was appearing on IG Monitor.
Taegin, we've heard from Jennifer there talking about how important monitoring is to, this watchdog way of working on the courts and the tribunals themselves. What about the importance for communities who have actually been affected by the crimes to start with? I read a piece you wrote where you described it as, quote, crucial in some way. Is it really crucial?
Yes, it's extremely important, because I think particularly when we're talking about international crimes trials, it's not just what happens in the courtroom that's, important, like looking at the process holistically and how victims are impacted by the trial, if they are impacted at all, what will affect, the success of the court as an institution. If the victims know about what's going on, if they see as justice being done to their communities or for their communities, it's, the court also, I think, needs the support and buy-in of affected communities who have lived through these crimes. And I think hearing voices in particular, this is one thing that we try to do on IJ Monitor, is, partner with some local organizations, whether they're NGOs or media, to also bring up voices from those communities onto the website to provide additional context to the trial in the way that just reading about courtroom events doesn't necessarily provide.
You've talked also about the kind of the need that tribunals have for an outreach strategy. I think the quote is, "The absence of an outreach strategy undermines the legitimacy and the legacy of the tribunals." Can you explain a bit how that works, and do you have an idea of what is like successful outreach and what is unsuccessful outreach of the courts that we're kind of have around us now?
I think one of the criticisms of the ICC and its outreach is that it often comes too late. A lot of this has been discussed in the independent expert review, the final report. It's been mentioned just how it often comes too late. During preliminary examinations, there's no communication strategy at all, certainly not court-wide. And it's really allows for misinformation to spread if you don't have a good outreach and communication strategy from the very beginning, because it uses, especially when you're dealing with authoritarian countries, or you're going after these high level political actors, they have the space then to spin the story and to spread misinformation, to then have the communities not trust the court or not understand how it works or just be fed lies. So it's really a lot of missed opportunities, I think. And it's, those are highlighted also in the independent expert report. I think the Special Court of Sierra Leone has been heralded as, one of the best examples of outreach strategies. I mean, it was different because it was also embedded in Freetown. So they were just much closer to the community, but their outreach events involved all parties, defense and prosecution, victims representatives, to have community dialogues and exchanges. There was radio programming about the trials, and it was seen as largely successful in terms of informing the population about what's going on and why it's important to them in their lives. And I think, there's several factors that make it more complicated at the ICC because it's in so many different locations and the court is based thousands of miles away.
Jennifer, you've got a really strong legal background yourself. So I kind of wonder, when you look at trying to put monitoring together, how do you balance between the legal side, which is absolutely fascinating for legal nerds, and then actually trying to tell the story of what's going on and make it more generally acceptable to people so that people actually want to read it? How do you balance that?
Not very well. Again, my shtick, it depends on your audience and the goals for trial monitoring. For example, the War Crime Study Center trial monitoring of the Taylor trial tended to be much more legal and much more academic and focused. That mapped on to the goals of that monitoring program, and our audience at that time was much more practitioner and academic oriented. Whereas at IJ Monitor and the ICC trial monitoring it was much more geared towards a broader general audience and for general consumption. So I had to learn by doing on how to tone down some of that legalese. But it's also a little bit of an ethical issue. I always took it very seriously that the trial monitoring had to be completely neutral. So as we're reporting on things, these stories are very dramatic. They're very emotional. And you want to be able to tell that story in a way that does justice and honors the experience of everybody involved. But at the same time, we are monitoring a legal proceeding. So in terms of telling a story, my reports were full of the witness testified. According to the witness, the defense lawyers claimed that, just to remind people that it couldn't be taken out of context, that these were testimonies and this was evidence presented in court. And they couldn't be presented factually, or even if a witness was quoted, you couldn't present that quote as a fact. It had to be what the witness explained or said or asked. So that takes away, I think, from the storytelling aspect of it. It does make the stories a lot more dry, confusing, but that was the goal, right? It had to be neutral, and because a lot of these reports were picked up and copied verbatim through various news sources and other organizations as one of the intents of the project, that was really important to adhere to. And then on the other side, in terms of balancing storytelling itself and wanting to make things more interesting for readers, I always had to think about whether I was sensationalizing any of these experiences or stories, because really the witness experience and the testimony is not clickbait, and it shouldn't have been treated that way. And so I think sometimes they weren't necessarily compelling stories to read, such as some of the other narratives that come out of the trial monitoring or trial reporting, but we were trying to adhere to those core principles.
Let me pick it up with Taegin now, because I think you've already mentioned how important it is to have some of these local perspectives that you got information in and sharing from different NGOs on the ground. But I was also conscious how important it was for me that you had local people doing the writing, and we had some of the tremendous expertise of somebody like Alpha Cisse or Tom Maliti or Wakabi, who really knew both the communities and the trials. Was that important for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think with these these international crimes trials, they sit with a much broader political, cultural, ethnic context, and really understanding that will actually make your reporting and your monitoring work better. understanding, how conflicts originated and the locations that they're talking about is really essential to getting the facts, right and reporting accurately. So that's extremely important. And also it allowed, Tom being based in Kenya and Alpha did, Sierra Leonean, and he was able to do outreach in Sierra Leone, and they have a connection with the community. They're seen as much more credible within the community as well, who some of the monitoring reports are intended to reach. And I think it was very, very important to us to have voices on the site monitoring the trials in those communities.
Oh, I've just realized that I have my vaccination appointment more or less right now, so I need to get off this podcast and get to the vaccination center. So I'm going to leave Janet to do the rest of this podcast, and I'm very sorry.
Go,
okay.
Go. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Jennifer, I wanted to pick up with you now on what's going to happen next. Who's picking up the baton now? I feel a little bit strange asking you about all of this because I've been involved with both you, Jennifer, and with Taegin with creating a space, a guide, looking at how to develop a community. So I feel a bit self-serving asking this question, but here we go. I have the sense that there are a lot of different initiatives out there now who are looking at monitoring different trials. It's like everybody says, yes, I should do it. Are you conscious, Jennifer, that there's now a community that's been created and people who know about how to do this?
I think that there is definitely a community of people who know about this, who understand the importance of it. I unfortunately don't think that always translates into the donor community. And as Taegin mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast, consistent trial monitoring on the level of IJ Monitor and following the courts of the ICC is quite expensive. It is difficult to convince, or I have found it difficult to convince donors to be able to support financially an ongoing monitoring program of that nature and scope, especially when you're designing a program that, for example, the Uganda trial, it stops 10 years later, we're still waiting. So if when we were trying to raise funds for a monitoring program based in Uganda, if we would have gotten funding for that, what would have happened, right? We would 10 years later and you're still there. So I think that there's a community of practice. I think there's a lot of people who really get it. I don't know that means that there is a community of trial monitoring programs that has been built around to fill in this big gap that will be left.
Taegin?
Yeah, I think Jennifer gives a pretty accurate description of where things stand. I think it's exciting to see newer groups enter the field, like this SJAC that I mentioned, Syria Justice and Accountability Center, and Civitas Maxima, who's doing work on cases from the Liberian Civil War that are universal jurisdiction cases. There hasn't been a broader translation into work being done in other countries, unfortunately, particularly in Africa, where some of the ICC trials are going on, which are really, it's really crucial to get information to those local communities. It's hard to reach, populations in the Central African Republic and Mali who've been impacted by the crimes that are now on trial for its people being tried for. And it's a shame that more larger organizations aren't trying to think creatively about how to reach those communities to cover the trials. Trust Africa also actually did some great work covering the Hassan Halbright trial, and that was encouraging. So perhaps more initiatives can come about, especially when they realize there is this, gap that's been left at the ICC level with IJ Monitor.
I had an interesting conversation recently with a Dutch-based group who are looking into monitoring Yazidi trials. And of course, I was able to offer them the guide that we've put together, which essentially says, think about why you're doing it beforehand and think about who it's for. And that's the main thing. But I had that sense then of, there are all these trials going on. People do want to know what's actually happening in them. There is a market out there for for the detail of what's happening in these trials. So we should definitely try to get more and more people monitoring them. Jennifer, are you finding that people are approaching you to ask for advice at any point, or to try to set up any other monitoring programs, or it's not top of their agenda?
No, in my experience, it hasn't been top of their agenda, although I think it definitely should be, especially as we're moving into this age of misinformation and disinformation, and there's so many different narratives and so many different people trying to control narratives about conflict and mass human rights abuses that we really need to be thinking about different and more creative ways, as you said, Janet, to be able to follow these trials and to be able to follow them consistently, and not just dropping in and dropping out at moments that might be more interesting to the international community.
I'm now going to ask you both our general asymmetrical haircuts questions. And the first one is, are there any questions that we should have asked that you would like us to ask right now? Taegin, you go first.
I think one thing I wanted to highlight was, some of the struggles that we had with the program, because one of the purported goals, initially, especially with the Taylor trial, which we were largely successful on, was reaching impacted communities when trials were taking place, thousands of miles away in The Hague. That became increasingly difficult with the ICC cases. In Eastern Congo, a website wasn't with updates on the trial going on in The Hague wasn't going to cut it. And, we were able to partner with a local radio station, which was great, but it also meant, our work was done in English primarily, and it had to be translated. And so there was a delay naturally, and before it could be, incorporated into a radio program there. And even then, we didn't have the resources or bandwidth capacity, I guess, to really invest in other types of content dissemination, like SMS, which may have been more useful, and other creative platforms like that. It was really actually encouraging to see that the ICC was starting to do, some of that work in Uganda and northern Uganda during the Ongwen trial. And so that's, I think, one thing to think about in terms of when you are designing a project is, we cover this too in the communication section of our guide. How are you going to transmit it? And is that going to reach your intended audience?
Jennifer, anything that we should have asked?
Yeah, I think it's important to just highlight the experience of trial monitoring for trial monitors and the importance of psychological support and helping, as you talked about, this community of practice and community of support. It's really important to understand that for people who are following trials day in and day out, they hear all of the testimony, including all of the really traumatic testimony and horrible crimes that were allegedly committed by the accused. But as small organizations, as on a shoestring budget, oftentimes a lot of trial monitors are students or they're early professionals getting their foot in the door of international justice work, and they don't have the larger resources for that kind of psychological support and PTSD support that people working within the court may have. And so I think that's an important aspect to just keep in mind for anybody who's considering doing this kind of work or who has done this kind of work. And it's something that really shouldn't be, just in general and working in international justice, many different iterations of this, but it's not something that we should shy away from talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I was on my points to mention as well in terms of the secondary trauma. Whether you're in the courtroom or you're just editing reports, it adds up. One of the hardest times for me ever during this job is right after I came back from my maternity leave, and I was reviewing and editing post on the Sepper Zarco case in Guatemala, which is this horrific sexual slavery case. It resulted in one of the first known domestic convictions for sexual slavery as an international violation of international humanitarian law. But I'm sitting there, I have a 6-month-old baby at home, and I have all these hormones, and reading these reports about these, brave survivors, and crying at my desk because you can't process that information. It's not normal. Like what these trials cover are, unfortunately some of the worst of humanity. And so knowing that, and I'm also really proud, Jennifer and I discussed this a lot, but I'm also really proud that we included, a section of this in our guide in the very first chapter in terms of when you're designing your program and managing your team, some of the harm that could actually come to you, even if, I think we all want to make ourselves martyrs in a way in this field because we're not the actual victims. We're not the ones that, faced torture or faced, sexual slavery, but it doesn't mean it doesn't accumulate and impacts us.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I have not had that experience of having to watch a trial day in, day out, and having to write up really bad things from it. So if that ever does happen to me, then I will be very careful. Thank you. And our last question that we always ask is, what are you listening to or reading or watching? And it doesn't have to be in this field. It can be something completely different, particularly as we talk about getting away from the atrocity field. Any binge watching, Jennifer, on Netflix?
Yes, talk about escapism. We just started watching Vikings, so there you have it.
Plenty of blood and gore in that. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Anything else that you want to recommend to people?
I just started a really great new book called Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, and I'm really just into it, but it's one of these, it's already got me turned upside down in terms of its perspective. It touches a little bit more on my work in the technology sector, but it's fascinating.
And Taegin.
Gosh, I'm doing more harm to myself. I just started the 4th season of The Handmaid's Tale. So it's very scary and dystopian, and but it's riveting, and it's an excellent show, but scary. I've read a couple really great books. Maybe this says something about my headspace, but more memoir oriented. I just read Untamed by Glennon Doyle, which is really great. Really great read. Her perspective is, she writes about how specifically women have been tamed in a way by society and culture to play certain roles and to fit in, quote unquote boxes in a way, and how to, trying to break that and be more honest with yourself and what you want. And she has a really interesting background, and she gives a lot of great advice on parenting too, which I appreciated. I also read Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, which touches a lot about the Asian American experience. It's a pretty short read, but it's really fascinating, and also makes me realize how much I don't know about U.S. history, particularly in our relationship with Asian countries and my understanding of the Korean War. And so I think learning about that perspective, just because of all of the increase in anti-Asian violence in the United States has been really horrific over the past years, and trying to, better understand the context and the history behind it too.
Well, thank you both for such a broad range of really different things to watch, listen to, not listen to in your case, but to read. So great. I think it's time for me to say goodbye. I need to say it on behalf of Stephanie as well, who had to rush out as she suddenly realised that her vaccine appointment was closer than it appeared. Luckily, she lives in a small town, so she's able to get to it fairly quickly. So I'm holding my thumbs for her. Hope that everything goes well for her appointment. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you, Taegin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Asymmetrical Haircuts is presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode has obviously been recorded at home, but we'd still like to give a shout out to our regular host, Humanity Hub, and we hope to return there soon. Music was by audionautics.com. We're available on all major podcast apps. Give us a rating and spread the word.